The soft hum of engines filled the air as passengers began boarding Flight 472, a transcontinental journey operated by one of the most prestigious airlines in the world. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin exuded luxury, with plush seats upholstered in creamy leather, personal attendants bustling quietly to prepare for takeoff, and the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifting through the air. Among the well-dressed executives, celebrities, and affluent travelers was a woman who, at first glance, seemed to blend in, but only if you didn't look too closely. Simone Carter stepped into the cabin with a quiet confidence. Her sharp yet understated black suit and modest hat gave her an air of sophistication, though she didn't flaunt any visible markers of wealth. Her demeanor was calm, almost unassuming, yet her eyes held a clarity that spoke of someone who knew her place in the world. Simone preferred it this way, flying under the radar, observing and blending in when necessary. She wasn't here to make a statement, she was here to assess. As the CEO and majority shareholder of this very airline, this was her discreet way of experiencing the service firsthand. Official visits often yielded polished facade and rehearsed professionalism, but this was the unfiltered truth. Her entrance, however, did not go unnoticed by one person. Matthew Brenner, the lead flight steward for first class, had been scanning the faces of passengers, as he always did, assessing who he deemed important, who might tip generously, and, in his own words, who didn't belong. Simone, to him, immediately fell into the latter category. Her understated appearance irritated him. The way she moved with quiet assurance seemed, in his eyes, like an unwarranted display of entitlement. Another one trying to act the part, Matthew thought to himself as he pasted on his customer service smile, the one that only reached his lips but never his eyes. He watched as Simone took her seat, quietly placed her carry-on in the overhead compartment, and sat down without a word to him or anyone else. She didn't ask for champagne, didn't demand assistance, and didn't fuss over amenities. Instead, she retrieved a slim, leather-bound notebook from her bag and began jotting something down. This was not what Matthew expected from someone in first class. He was used to bold, flashy passengers, people who openly displayed their wealth and demanded constant attention. For reasons he couldn't fully articulate, Simone's presence unsettled him. Her calmness felt, to him, like arrogance. He made a mental note to keep an eye on her. The pre-flight preparations continued. Passengers were offered champagne or sparkling water, warm towels were distributed, and menus for the onboard meal service were handed out. Matthew moved seamlessly between the aisles, lavishing attention on passengers who greeted him warmly or appeared particularly wealthy. He exchanged pleasantries with a middle-aged couple who had requested a rare vintage of wine. He even made sure to adjust the blanket of a young tech billionaire traveling with his assistant. All the while, he avoided Simone. But Simone noticed. She noticed the way Matthew skipped her row entirely during his rounds, how he avoided eye contact, and how his tone shifted when addressing different passengers. Years of navigating boardrooms and managing people had trained her to observe such things. Yet she said nothing. She simply sat back, adjusted her hat slightly, and made a few more notes in her book. When the plane taxied to the runway and finally lifted into the sky, Matthew found himself glancing in Simone's direction more than once. His irritation simmered. There was something about her composed indifference that made him want to provoke her, to remind her who was in charge of this cabin. He didn't know why he cared so much, but his feelings began to fester. About an hour into the flight, the cabin settled into a relaxed rhythm. Passengers reclined their seats, sipped on wine, or dove into the in-flight entertainment. Simone, meanwhile, closed her notebook and asked for a glass of sparkling water. When Matthew approached her, his smile was tight. He placed the glass on her tray without a word and turned to leave. "Thank you," Simone said, her voice steady but her tone polite. Matthew stopped for a moment, then glanced over his shoulder. "Enjoy," he replied curtly, before walking away. He didn't offer the same warmth or charm he had shown other passengers. Simone watched him leave, her expression neutral, though the wheels in her mind were clearly turning. The tension between them might have ended there. But Matthew, driven by a need to assert himself, decided to escalate the situation. As the second drink service began, he returned to Simone's seat and leaned slightly over her. "Ma'am, we have certain policies regarding headwear during meal service," he said, his tone dripping with feigned professionalism. "We'll need you to remove your hat." Simone looked up at him, her face composed but her eyes sharp. "I wasn't aware of any such policy," she replied. "I'd like to keep it on." "Thank you." Matthew straightened, his jaw tightening. "It's standard procedure, ma'am. I'm sure you'd want to comply with regulations." Simone set down her water glass and folded her hands neatly in her lap. "I'm familiar with the policies of this airline," she said evenly. "There's no such regulation. If there's a legitimate safety concern, please elaborate." Her calm rebuttal only fueled Matthew's irritation. "We have to ensure the comfort of all passengers, and your headwear might obstruct our service or cause unnecessary discomfort. I'm sure you understand." "Is someone uncomfortable?" Simone asked, raising an eyebrow. Her tone wasn't confrontational, but it carried a weight that gave Matthew pause. "Because if there's an issue, I'd be happy to discuss it with them directly." Matthew felt a flash of anger at her composed response. She wasn't giving him the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, she was maintaining her calm, quietly dismantling his excuses one by one. He stepped back abruptly, muttering something about checking with the captain. As he walked away, Simone returned to her notebook. She wasn't flustered, but her focus was sharper now. She wasn't just observing anymore, she was documenting. In the galley, Matthew paced, trying to steady his breathing. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing control of the situation. That woman had challenged him, made him look small in front of the other passengers. He decided that she needed to be reminded of her place. What Matthew didn't realize, however, was that the woman in seat 1 wasn't just any passenger, and by the end of this flight he would come to regret every decision he'd made. Simone Carter had dealt with men like Matthew before, petty tyrants who mistook their position for power. But unlike others who might have tolerated his behavior, Simone had no intention of letting this go unnoticed. She wasn't just documenting for herself. She was preparing for something much bigger. The cabin of Flight 472 hummed with the quiet activity of first-class service. But beneath the polished veneer of luxury, tensions began to simmer. Matthew Brenner, now fully focused on Simone Carter, felt his irritation deepen with every passing minute. Her refusal to comply with his fabricated headwear policy had stung his pride. She hadn't yelled or raised her voice, her calm demeanor had disarmed him, leaving him feeling foolish. He couldn't let it stand. In his mind, he was the authority here, and she had dared to undermine him. That wouldn't do. As the meal service began, Matthew saw an opportunity to escalate. He approached her seat again, this time with an air of forced politeness that barely masked his growing irritation. "Ma'am, I need to insist that you remove your hat during meal service," he said, his voice sharper than before. Simone didn't even look up from her notebook. "I believe we've already discussed this, haven't we?" she replied, her tone measured. "There's no policy requiring me to remove it, and I'd appreciate it if we could move on." Matthew's jaw tightened. He glanced around the cabin, noting how the other passengers were beginning to take subtle notice of their exchange. His irritation shifted to a need to assert dominance. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to call the captain if you refuse to comply," he said, his voice rising slightly. Simone finally looked up, fixing him with a steady gaze. "Feel free," she said simply, then returned to her notes. Her calmness wasn't just unnerving, it was infuriating. She wasn't playing by his rules, and Matthew couldn't stand it. Unable to contain himself, Matthew spun on his heel and stormed toward the galley. There, he grabbed a phone and made a show of calling the cockpit. He spoke loudly enough for anyone nearby to hear, deliberately dramatizing the situation. "Yes, Captain, we have a non-compliant passenger in seat 1A, he said, emphasizing the word non-compliant. "She's refusing to follow our regulations, and it's causing a disturbance in the cabin." Simone, still seated, didn't react. Instead, she calmly took a sip of her water and resumed writing. If Matthew had hoped to rattle her, he was failing spectacularly. After hanging up the phone, Matthew returned to Simone, this time with a determined glint in his eye. He was done playing games. "Ma'am," he said loudly, his voice cutting through the soft murmur of the cabin, "for the safety and comfort of all passengers, I am asking you one last time to remove your hat. If you refuse, I will have no choice but to escalate this further." Simone slowly closed her notebook, setting it down on the tray table. She looked up at him with the same composed expression she'd worn throughout the flight. "You keep using the word safety," she said evenly. "Perhaps you could explain how my hat is a safety concern. Or are you simply trying to make a point?" A murmur rippled through the nearby passengers, some of whom were now openly watching the exchange. Matthew felt a flush of embarrassment rise in his cheeks. "This is not up for debate," he snapped, his professional mask slipping. "Remove the hat, or I'll be forced to involve security when we land." Simone leaned back in her seat, crossing her arms. "Security," she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You're threatening to call security over a hat." "I'm not threatening," Matthew retorted. "I'm enforcing airline policy." Simone's gaze didn't waver. "What you're enforcing," she said quietly, "is your own prejudice. Let me be very clear, I will not be removing my hat because I am not violating any policy. If you feel the need to escalate further, you're welcome to do so. But I assure you, you're making a mistake." Matthew opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For a moment he simply stood there, staring at her, his fists clenched at his sides. He felt the weight of the other passengers' eyes on him, and his frustration boiled over. Without another word, he turned and stormed back to the galley. In the privacy of the galley, Matthew paced back and forth, trying to calm himself. "Who does she think she is?" he muttered under his breath. Every interaction with Simone felt like a personal affront, a challenge to his authority. He couldn't let her win. Not here, not in front of everyone. He needed to regain control of the situation, to remind her and the rest of the cabin that he was in charge. He grabbed a handheld intercom and paged the junior steward to join him. When the young woman arrived, looking slightly nervous, Matthew gestured toward Simone's seat. "I need you to watch seat 1A, he said sharply. "She's causing a disruption, and I don't trust her not to escalate things further." The junior steward hesitated. I didn't notice her causing any disruption," she said tentatively. Matthew shot her a withering look. "Are you questioning my judgment?" The young woman quickly shook her head. "No, sir. I'll keep an eye on her." Satisfied, Matthew dismissed her and turned his attention to the cart of meals waiting to be served. He'd deal with Simone after the meal service, but he wouldn't let this go. Meanwhile, Simone remained seated, outwardly calm but inwardly steeling herself. She had dealt with men like Matthew before, petty tyrants who mistook their positions for power. She knew his type all too well, and she wasn't about to let him dictate the terms of this interaction. Still, she understood the importance of timing. For now, she would wait. As the meal service concluded and the cabin settled into a lull, Matthew decided it was time to make his move. He approached Simone's seat once again, this time accompanied by the junior steward, who looked visibly uncomfortable. "Ma'am," he said curtly, "I need you to step into the galley with me. We need to discuss this matter in private." Simone glanced at the junior steward, noting the discomfort in her expression, before turning her attention back to Matthew. "Discuss what, exactly?" she asked. "You've already made your position clear." "This isn't up for discussion," Matthew snapped. "Please come with me." For a moment, Simone considered refusing outright. But then she realized that going with him might give her the opportunity to gather more information about his motives and his next move. "Very well," she said, rising from her seat. "Lead the way." The junior steward stepped aside as Matthew escorted Simone toward the galley. As they entered the small, cramped space, Matthew closed the curtain behind them, effectively cutting them off from the rest of the cabin. He turned to face her, his expression hard. "Listen," he began, his voice low but firm. "I don't know who you think you are, but on this flight, I'm the authority, and I'm not going to let you undermine me." Simone raised an eyebrow. "Undermine you?" she repeated. "By sitting quietly in my seat and refusing to remove my hat." Matthew took a step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You're not like the other passengers here," he said. "You don't belong in first class, and I'm not going to let you disrupt this flight with your attitude." Simone's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. "I see," she said slowly. "So this isn't about policy. It's about your perception of who belongs and who doesn't." Matthew faltered, caught off guard by her directness. I don't have to explain myself to you," he stammered. "If you won't comply, I'll have no choice but to take further action." Simone stepped closer, her voice calm but firm. "I suggest you think very carefully about your next move," she said, "because you're on the verge of making a very costly mistake." Matthew opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a voice crackled over the intercom, announcing turbulence ahead. The plane jolted slightly, breaking the tension in the galley. Simone took a step back, her composure unshaken. "We'll continue this conversation later," Matthew said, his tone clipped. Simone said nothing. She simply turned and walked back to her seat, her mind racing. She had dealt with difficult situations before, but this was personal, and she wasn't about to let it slide. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had become noticeably tenser since Simone returned to her seat, though she sat silently, resuming her notes as though nothing had happened. The air around her practically hummed with unspoken energy. Her calm demeanor masked the storm building within her. Years of navigating high-stakes boardrooms and hostile negotiations had trained her to remain composed under pressure, but even she couldn't deny the irritation bubbling beneath her surface. Matthew Brenner, meanwhile, stood in the galley, gripping the edge of the counter so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His breathing was shallow, and his mind raced with conflicting emotions. He'd thought he could handle Simone, intimidate her into submission, but instead, she had matched him at every turn, her calmness like a wall he couldn't breach. Worse, he felt the weight of other passengers' glances on his back, and in his mind, their silence wasn't neutrality, it was judgment. He had to reassert control, had to remind everyone, especially her, that he was the authority here. And he was determined to make her pay for the humiliation she had inflicted on him. But Matthew wasn't just angry, he was embarrassed. In his mind, Simone was deliberately mocking him, making him look weak in front of everyone. He couldn't allow that to stand. His mind latched onto the hat again, fixating on it like a symbol of her defiance. She had to be hiding something, why else would she refuse to remove it? His imagination ran wild with baseless suspicions, and he convinced himself that he was justified in taking further action. After all, he told himself, this was about security, about safety, about maintaining the sanctity of his cabin. Steeling himself, he called over the junior steward. The young woman, barely out of her training program, approached hesitantly. She had witnessed Matthew's earlier confrontation with Simone and had seen how poorly it was received by the other passengers. She didn't want to be involved, but she also didn't dare refuse him. "Yes, Mr. Brenner?" she asked timidly. "I need you to retrieve the grooming kit from storage," he said briskly. The steward frowned. "The grooming kit? For?" Matthew shot her a sharp look. "Just do it." The junior steward nodded reluctantly and disappeared into the storage area. Matthew stood alone for a moment, staring at the curtain that separated the galley from the first-class cabin. He could hear the low murmur of passengers talking quietly among themselves, their voices barely audible over the hum of the engines. He felt his chest tighten with frustration. They were probably talking about him, judging him, and it was all because of her. The junior steward returned a moment later, carrying a small leather case containing scissors, clippers, and other grooming tools typically used for emergencies. She handed it to Matthew with a nervous expression. "Are you sure this is necessary?" she asked hesitantly. Matthew didn't answer. He snatched the kit from her hands and marched toward Simone's seat. Simone was in the middle of jotting down a particularly scathing observation about the lack of professionalism she had witnessed when she sensed Matthew approaching. She looked up just as he stopped in front of her, his face set in a mask of forced authority. In his hands, he clutched the leather grooming kit. "Ma'am," he said, his voice unnervingly calm, "I've given you multiple opportunities to comply with our safety policies. Since you've refused, I'm left with no choice but to address the issue myself." Simone raised an eyebrow, her gaze flickering briefly to the kit in his hands before returning to his face. "Address the issue," she repeated, her tone laced with quiet incredulity. "And what exactly do you plan to do?" Matthew didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the intercom attached to the wall near her seat. Pressing the button, he made an announcement to the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption. Due to a non-compliance issue, I will be addressing a passenger-related concern to ensure the safety and comfort of everyone aboard." The vague, ominous message sent a ripple of unease through the cabin. Passengers turned in their seats, craning their necks to see what was happening. Simone, however, remained calm, her expression unreadable. Matthew turned back to her. "You've left me no choice," he said. "Please remove your hat, or I'll have to take matters into my own hands." Simone tilted her head slightly, regarding him with a mix of amusement and disdain. "Take matters into your own hands," she echoed. "Are you threatening to remove my hat yourself?" "I'm doing what's necessary," Matthew snapped. "You've given me no other option." Simone's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "You're making a very dangerous assumption, Mr. Brenner." Matthew ignored the warning in her tone. Without waiting for her consent, he set the grooming kit down on the tray table in front of her and reached for the scissors. The audacity of his actions caused a collective gasp from the surrounding passengers, who watched in stunned silence as the scene unfolded. "Enough," Simone said sharply, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. She rose to her feet, towering over Matthew despite his attempts to maintain control. "This has gone far enough. You've brought this on yourself," Matthew retorted, though his voice wavered slightly. He was beginning to realize that he might have underestimated her. Simone took a step closer to him, her presence commanding. "You've harassed me, humiliated me, and now you think you have the right to lay a hand on me," she said, her voice low but filled with steel. "Let me make something very clear. If you touch me, you will regret it." Matthew faltered, momentarily thrown off by the intensity of her gaze. But his stubborn pride wouldn't let him back down. He reached for the scissors again, determined to follow through. Simone's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with a strength that belied her composed exterior. Her grip was firm but controlled, and her expression was one of pure, unyielding authority. "That's enough," she said, her voice ringing with finality. "Sit down." The command in her tone was so absolute that for a moment, Matthew actually considered obeying. But then he wrenched his wrist free and took a step back, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "You're out of control," he muttered, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "I'll be filing a report about this." "Good," Simone replied coldly. "I'll look forward to reading it." She turned and sat back down, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Matthew stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. He felt the weight of the passengers' stares, their silence more damning than any words. Finally, he grabbed the grooming kit and retreated to the galley, his shoulders stiff with frustration. Back in the galley, Matthew paced furiously, his mind racing. He knew he had overstepped, but he couldn't bring himself to admit it, not to himself, and certainly not to her. He needed a way to regain control, to salvage his authority. But as he racked his brain for a solution, he realized with growing dread that he might have finally pushed too far. Meanwhile, in her seat, Simone adjusted her hat and picked up her notebook once more. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote, the adrenaline from the confrontation still coursing through her veins, but her mind was sharp, her resolve unshaken. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been subjected to the kind of indignity she had just endured, and she intended to make sure that no one would ever have to endure it again. The tension in the cabin lingered, a silent but palpable reminder of what had just transpired. The passengers exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of shock and unease, but no one said a word. They simply watched as Simone returned to her notes, her composure as unyielding as ever. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin was suffocating, charged with a tension that no one dared to acknowledge openly. Simone Carter remained seated, her back straight, her hat perfectly in place, as if nothing had happened. The faint hum of the engines filled the silence, punctuated only by the occasional clink of glasses or the shuffle of passengers shifting in their seats. To those observing her, she looked completely unbothered. But internally, Simone was calculating. In her years as a leader, Simone had learned the value of timing. Every word, every action, every decision was a thread in a larger tapestry of control. Right now, her silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. She knew Matthew wasn't finished, that his ego wouldn't allow him to leave things as they were. And when he inevitably escalated, she would be ready. In the galley, Matthew Brenner was pacing like a caged animal. His anger was palpable, his humiliation unbearable. He had been pushed to the brink in front of an audience of affluent, influential passengers, his usual playing field. But Simone had disrupted his carefully curated narrative of control. Worse, she hadn't even raised her voice or lost her composure. She had made him look small with nothing more than calm defiance, and he couldn't stand it. Matthew's junior steward, the young woman who had fetched the grooming kit earlier, stood to the side, clearly uncomfortable. She watched as Matthew muttered under his breath, occasionally slamming his fist against the counter in frustration. Finally, she spoke up. "Mr. Brenner," she said cautiously, "maybe we should let it go." She's not disrupting the flight. We've served the meal, and the passengers seem calm. I don't think pushing this further will end well. Matthew spun around, his eyes blazing. Let it go, he hissed. Do you have any idea what's at stake here? If we let one passenger dictate how we run this cabin, it undermines the entire structure of authority. The junior steward hesitated. But she hasn't done anything wrong. She's just sitting there. That's exactly the problem, Matthew snapped. She's defying me. If we let that stand, what's next? Chaos. Passengers ignoring seatbelt signs. People bringing unauthorized items on board. This isn't just about her, it's about maintaining order. The steward bit her lip, clearly torn. I don't think the other passengers see it that way. Matthew dismissed her with a wave of his hand. You don't get it. She's playing a game, and she's trying to make me look like the bad guy. But I'm not going to let her win. He grabbed the cabin intercom and made another announcement. His voice, though steady, was tinged with barely restrained anger. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience as we address an ongoing safety matter. Please remain seated and refrain from using the aisles as we work to ensure the safety and comfort of everyone on board. Simone heard the announcement and smirked slightly. A safety matter, she murmured under her breath, shaking her head. She closed her notebook, tucking it neatly into her carry-on bag. It was time to take this to the next level. Quietly, she reached into her pocket and tapped out a short message on her phone, a feature reserved for emergencies when cellular use was restricted. The message was sent to one recipient, Lewis. Lewis, her personal security detail seated in economy class, had been monitoring the situation from afar. While he hadn't yet intervened, he had noticed the growing tension and the way Matthew had been behaving towards Simone. When he received her message, a single word, ready, he knew what to do. Simone leaned back in her seat, her expression serene. She didn't look like a woman preparing to turn the tables, she looked like someone settling in for a long nap. But her calm exterior was a mask, carefully maintained to ensure that she remained in control. Meanwhile, Matthew had concocted his next move. He marched into the cockpit to speak with the captain, a man named Captain Gerald McAllister. The captain, a gruff but experienced pilot in his late 50s, looked up from his controls with a raised eyebrow as Matthew entered. "What's the issue now, Brenner?" McAllister asked, his tone suggesting he had little patience for unnecessary drama. "It's that woman in 1A, Matthew said, his voice tense. "She's refusing to comply with our policies, and it's causing a disturbance in the cabin." McAllister frowned. "A disturbance? What kind of disturbance?" Matthew hesitated for a moment. "She's being uncooperative. She won't remove her hat, and when I asked her to step into the galley to discuss the matter, she became aggressive." McAllister's frown deepened. "Aggressive? Did she threaten anyone?" "Well, no," Matthew admitted reluctantly. "But her tone was confrontational, and she's setting a bad example for the other passengers." The captain leaned back in his seat, studying Matthew with skeptical eye. "Brenner, I've been flying for over 30 years, and let me tell you something, there's a difference between a passenger being disruptive and a passenger not liking your tone. Did she violate any actual regulations?" Matthew bristled. "She's refusing to comply with a safety directive." "What safety directive?" Matthew faltered. "The one about headwear." The captain raised an eyebrow. "There's no such directive, Brenner. That's a judgment call on your part, and if it's not in the handbook, it's not enforceable. Are you sure you're not letting this get personal?" Matthew stiffened. "I'm doing my job, Captain." McAllister sighed. "Fine, but I'm not about to have this flight diverted because of a personality clash. Handle it, but keep it professional. Last thing we need is a complaint from a VIP." Matthew's face darkened, but he nodded. Understood, Captain. As he left the cockpit, he clenched his fists. VIP? Who did they think she was? Just another uppity passenger trying to stir trouble. But now he was more determined than ever to put her in her place. Back in the first-class cabin, Lewis had quietly made his way forward, taking a seat just outside the curtain that separated first class from the galley. He sat unobtrusively, his calm demeanor masking his readiness to act. He exchanged a brief glance with Simone, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod. The pieces were in place. Matthew returned to the cabin, his eyes locking on Simone as he approached her seat once more. He stopped in front of her, his hands on his hips. "Ma'am," he said sharply, "this is your final warning. Remove the hat, or I'll have no choice but to escalate this further." Simone looked up at him, her expression cool and unbothered. "You've been escalating this from the moment we boarded, Mr. Brenner," she said. "What more do you intend to do?" "Handcuff me. Drag me off the plane." Matthew's lips pressed into a thin line. "Don't tempt me." Simone raised an eyebrow. "Tempt you? Mr. Brenner, let me be perfectly clear. I have been more than patient with your behavior, but your actions today have crossed every line of professionalism. I suggest you step away now before you do something you can't take back." Matthew's face turned red with fury. "Are you threatening me?" Simone smiled faintly. "Not at all. I'm giving you an opportunity to salvage what little dignity you have left." That was the breaking point. Matthew reached for her hat, his hand trembling with suppressed rage. But before he could touch her, Lewis was there, standing between them with an air of quiet authority. "Mr. Brenner," Lewis said calmly, his voice low but firm, "I suggest you take a step back." Matthew froze, caught off guard by the sudden appearance of the man who had seemingly materialized out of nowhere. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. "I'm with her," Lewis said simply. "And I strongly advise you to reconsider your actions." Matthew's eyes darted between Lewis and Simone, his mind racing. Something was off. This wasn't normal. Passengers didn't travel with bodyguards unless. Realization began to dawn, but it was too late. Simone rose to her feet, adjusting her hat with a deliberate slowness that only heightened the tension. "Mr. Brenner," she said, her voice as cold as steel, "you've made a series of very poor decisions today, and now you're going to face the consequences." Before Matthew could respond, Lewis stepped forward, producing a discreet identification badge from his pocket. "I think it's time we had a conversation," he said, privately. As Lewis escorted Matthew toward the galley, the first-class cabin erupted into murmurs. Simone remained standing for a moment, her composure unshaken. Then, with a small, satisfied smile, she sat back down. The game had changed, and now, the real reckoning would begin. The first-class cabin was buzzing with nervous energy. Passengers exchanged whispered conversations, their eyes darting toward the galley where Matthew Brenner had disappeared with Lewis. Simone Carter remained seated, her expression calm, almost detached. To the outside observer, she looked as though she had completely detached herself from the drama. But internally, Simone was more focused than ever. She had given Matthew every chance to back down, and he had refused. Now it was time to bring his actions and his entire approach to power into the harsh light of accountability. Behind the curtain of the galley, the air was thick with tension. Matthew stood rigidly, his hands clenched at his sides as Lewis faced him with a composed yet commanding demeanor. The junior steward hovered uncertainly by the coffee machine, pretending to rearrange cups but clearly eavesdropping on the confrontation. "Who do you think you are? Barging in like this?" Matthew spat, his face red with frustration. "You're not part of the crew. You have no authority here." Lewis tilted his head slightly, regarding Matthew with an almost amused expression. "You're right," he said evenly. "I'm not part of the crew. But let me make something very clear, my authority comes from her." He gestured toward the first-class cabin where Simone sat in quiet composure. Matthew's jaw tightened as the implication of Lewis's words began to sink in. His mind raced to piece together what he was missing. Simone wasn't just some random passenger, there was more to her, something he hadn't considered. But his pride refused to let him back down. "I don't care who she is," Matthew snapped. "On this flight I'm in charge, and if she can't follow the rules she'll face the consequences." Lewis raised an eyebrow, his expression cool. "The rules? Interesting. Can you point me to the specific regulation that states passengers are required to remove their hats during a flight? Or is this one of your creative interpretations?" Matthew bristled. "I don't need to justify myself to you. This is about maintaining order in the cabin." "No," Lewis interrupted sharply, his voice cutting through the galley like a blade. "This is about your ego. You singled her out because you thought she didn't belong, and instead of de-escalating the situation, you've turned it into a personal crusade to assert your dominance. That's not maintaining order, that's abuse of power." The junior steward flinched at the harshness of Lewis's tone, but Matthew refused to back down. "You don't know what you're talking about," he hissed. "She's been defiant since the moment she stepped on this plane. I gave her every opportunity to comply, and she refused." "Comply with what?" Lewis shot back. "Your fabricated rules? Your baseless accusations? Or your thinly veiled attempts to humiliate her?" For a moment, Matthew was speechless. His eyes darted toward the curtain separating the galley from the cabin, as if hoping someone would come to his defense. But no one did. The junior steward avoided his gaze, clearly unwilling to get involved. Lewis took a step closer, his presence imposing despite his calm demeanor. "Let me explain something to you, Mr. Brenner," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "You've spent this entire flight treating her like she's beneath you. But do you know who she is? Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Matthew's confidence faltered for the first time. He opened his mouth to respond, but Lewis didn't give him the chance. "She's Simone Carter," Lewis said, enunciating each word with precision, "CEO and majority shareholder of this airline." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The junior steward's eyes widened, and Matthew's face turned a shade paler. For a moment, he looked as though he might collapse under the weight of the revelation. That's impossible," Matthew stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. She doesn't look." Lewis's expression hardened, his gaze piercing. "She doesn't look like what?" he asked sharply. "Like someone who could own an airline? Like someone who deserves to sit in first class? Like someone who could challenge your warped sense of authority?" Matthew took a step back, his confidence unraveling. He had spent the entire flight assuming he was dealing with an ordinary passenger, someone he could intimidate and control. But now the reality of his situation was crashing down around him, and he was struggling to process it. She should have said something," he muttered weakly, grasping for a lifeline. "She gave you every chance to treat her with respect," Lewis countered. "You chose to see her as a threat instead of a human being. And now you're going to face the consequences of that choice." While the confrontation continued in the galley, Simone remained in her seat, her composure unbroken. Passengers in first class were murmuring amongst themselves, their curiosity and unease growing with each passing moment. Some had picked up snippets of the earlier exchange, and others had simply noticed the tension in the air. But none of them dared to ask her directly what was happening. One passenger, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit, leaned toward Simone and spoke in a low voice. "Excuse me, ma'am, but is everything all right? That steward seems out of line. Simone turned her head slightly, offering him a small, polite smile. "Everything is under control," she said simply. "Thank you for your concern." Her tone left no room for further questions, and the man nodded awkwardly before retreating into his seat. Simone returned her attention to her notebook, but her mind was elsewhere. She wasn't thinking about the confrontation or the humiliation she had endured. She was thinking about what came next. In the galley, the situation had reached a boiling point. Matthew, now visibly shaken, was trying to salvage what little authority he had left. "Look," he said, his voice trembling, "maybe I overreacted, but I was just doing my job." Lewis's expression didn't soften. "Your job is to ensure the safety and comfort of every passenger on this flight," he said, "not to humiliate and intimidate them because of your personal biases." "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Matthew said desperately. "I didn't know who she was." "That's the problem," Lewis said coldly. "You shouldn't have to know someone's title to treat them with respect." Matthew fell silent, his head hanging low. For the first time, he realized the full extent of what he had done. He wasn't just facing a reprimand, he was facing the potential end of his career. "Here's what's going to happen," Lewis continued, his tone brooking no argument. "When this flight lands, you're going to report directly to the airline's disciplinary committee. You will be escorted off this plane, and your actions will be thoroughly investigated. And if I were you, I'd start thinking about how you're going to explain yourself." Matthew didn't respond. He simply nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. When Lewis returned to the first-class cabin, the passengers fell silent, their eyes following him as he approached Simone. He leaned down and spoke to her in a low voice. "It's handled," he said. "He won't bother you again." Simone nodded slightly, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Lewis," she said. "Take your seat. We'll deal with the rest when we land." Lewis gave her a brief nod and retreated to the row of seats just behind her, his watchful gaze never straying far. Simone leaned back in her seat, exhaling softly. The confrontation was over, but the fallout was just beginning. As the plane continued its journey, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin remained tense. Passengers whispered amongst themselves, exchanging theories and speculations about what had happened. But Simone didn't pay them any mind. She had more important things to focus on. When the plane finally began its descent, Simone retrieved her notebook and made a final note. "Accountability starts at the top." She closed the notebook with a decisive snap, ready to bring this chapter to a close and to ensure that the lessons learned today would resonate far beyond this flight. This wasn't just about punishing Matthew. It was about setting a precedent, about showing that no one, no matter their position, was above accountability. And Simone Carter was just the person to make that happen. The wheels of Flight 472 touched down with a soft thud, signaling the end of the tense, eventful journey. The first-class cabin remained eerily quiet as the plane taxied to the gate. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, many stealing furtive looks at Simone Carter, who sat silently in her seat. Her calm, unshaken demeanor only added to the mystery surrounding the events that had unfolded in the galley. For some, it was just a peculiar flight. For others, it felt like they had witnessed the prologue to something far greater. Matthew Brenner sat in the galley, his hands trembling as he clutched a cup of water he had poured to steady himself. His mind raced. He had spent the past 30 minutes replaying the series of events over and over in his head, trying to make sense of how everything had spiraled so disastrously out of control. He hadn't anticipated this. How could he have known that the woman in Warner wasn't just another passenger? But as much as he wanted to justify his actions to himself, the truth gnawed at him. His own arrogance, his own assumptions, had led him here. A crackle over the intercom broke the silence in the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've arrived at our destination. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign has been turned off. Thank you for flying with us today." The announcement was routine, but to Simone it was the sound of a new beginning. She waited as the plane came to a complete stop at the gate, her expression unreadable. Lewis, seated just behind her, gave her a subtle nod, signaling that everything was in place. As the plane began to disembark, Simone remained seated, letting the other passengers filter out ahead of her. Some walked past her with hurried, uncomfortable glances, while others offered hesitant nods of acknowledgement, unsure of what exactly had happened but sensing that she had played a pivotal role. Once the cabin was nearly empty, Simone stood, adjusted her hat, and turned to Lewis. "Let's go," she said simply. Together they made their way toward the galley. Matthew, still seated and visibly shaken, looked up as they approached. For a brief moment his eyes met Simone's, and the weight of her unflinching gaze made him shrink back in his seat. She didn't speak, didn't even spare him a word. Instead, she walked past him, her presence alone more damning than a reprimand could have been. Waiting for them at the exit of the aircraft was a group of airline officials, including 2 senior managers and a member of the company's legal team. They stood stiffly, their expressions a mixture of anxiety and professionalism. Behind them, 2 uniformed airport security officers waited discreetly, their presence subtle but impossible to ignore. "Is Carter," one of the managers said, stepping forward with a nervous smile. "We've been informed of the situation. Shall we proceed to the private lounge for a full debrief?" Simone nodded curtly. "Lead the way." The group moved swiftly through the airport, bypassing the usual terminals and bustling crowds. They were escorted to a sleek, private lounge reserved for VIPs and executives, where a conference room had been hastily prepared. Inside, a polished table awaited them, its surface gleaming under the soft overhead lighting. A pitcher of water and neatly arranged glasses sat in the center, untouched. Simone took her seat at the head of the table, Lewis standing silently behind her like a sentinel. The airline officials hesitated before sitting, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Finally, the senior manager, a woman in her late 40s with a crisp navy suit and a carefully composed expression, spoke up. "It's Carter, I want to begin by sincerely apologizing for what you experienced on your flight," she said, her tone measured but tinged with genuine concern. "I've already reviewed the preliminary report from the crew, and I assure you that the matter will be handled with the utmost seriousness." Simone raised a hand, silencing the woman mid-sentence. "Before we discuss how this will be handled," she said calmly, "I want to make one thing very clear. What happened on that flight wasn't an isolated incident. It was the result of a systemic failure, one that I will not tolerate within this company." The manager nodded quickly. "Of course, Ms. Carter. I completely agree. The actions of Mr. Brenner were unacceptable, and we're prepared to take immediate disciplinary action." "Immediate disciplinary action?" Simone repeated, her voice sharp. "Do you think that's sufficient? Firing one steward doesn't address the larger issue. This isn't just about Mr. Brenner. This is about the culture that allowed someone like him to operate unchecked for so long." The room fell silent. The managers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly caught off guard by the intensity of Simone's words. One of them, a younger man with a clipboard, cleared his throat nervously. "Evs Carter," he began tentatively, "with all due respect, we have policies in place to address misconduct. This appears to be an isolated case of one individual overstepping their authority." Simone's eyes narrowed, and the young man immediately regretted his words. "Isolated," she said, her tone icy. Let me tell you what's isolated: the willingness of this company's leadership to acknowledge its own failings. Do you know how many complaints we've received about discriminatory behavior from crew members in the past year? How many times those complaints were swept under the rug because they didn't seem worth investigating? This isn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern. And it ends now. The young man swallowed hard, sinking back into his chair. Simone turned her attention to the senior manager. Effective immediately, she said, I want a full audit of all passenger complaints filed in the past 5 years. Every incident of misconduct, every unresolved case, every pattern of bias, I want it all on my desk by the end of the week. The manager nodded, scribbling furiously in her notebook. Understood, Ms. Carter. And as for Mr. Brenner, Simone continued, her tone unrelenting, he will be placed on indefinite suspension pending a full investigation. Furthermore, I want his personnel file reviewed. If there's any indication that his behavior was known or tolerated by his supervisors, they will face disciplinary action as well. Yes, Ms. Carter, the manager said quickly. We'll make it a top priority. Simone leaned back in her chair, her gaze sweeping over the assembled officials. This company has a reputation to uphold, she said firmly. And that reputation isn't built on luxury seats or premium service. It's built on trust. Our passengers trust us to treat them with respect and dignity. If we can't uphold that, then we don't deserve their business. The room remained silent, the gravity of Simone's words hanging heavy in the air. Finally, the legal team representative, a sharp-eyed woman in a tailored grey suit, spoke up. Ms. Carter, she said carefully, your points are well taken. I'll ensure that the legal department supports the audit and investigation in any way necessary. And if you'd like, we can prepare a formal statement addressing the incident. Simone nodded. Make it clear that we take this matter seriously, but don't release anything until I've reviewed it personally. Understood, the legal representative said. Simone stood, signaling the end of the meeting. The officials scrambled to their feet, murmuring their thanks and assurances as she strode toward the door, Louis following close behind. As Simone exited the lounge, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The process was far from over, but the first steps had been taken. This wasn't just about holding Matthew accountable, it was about dismantling the structures that had allowed someone like him to thrive unchecked. She had always believed in leading by example, and today she had done exactly that. Louis walked beside her, his expression as stoic as ever. That was quite the performance, he said quietly. It wasn't a performance, Simone replied. It was a reckoning. Louis nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. And it's only the beginning. Simone didn't respond. She didn't need to. As they walked through the terminal, heads turned, whispers followed in their wake. But Simone paid them no mind. She was already focused on the next steps, the next battles. Because for her, this wasn't just about one flight, it was about setting a standard, one that no one would ever dare challenge again. The following morning, the offices of the airline's corporate headquarters buzzed with activity. Executives moved with hurried purpose, whispers of yesterday's events spreading like wildfire. Simone Carter's name was on everyone's lips, but not in the usual reverent tones reserved for their CEO. This time it carried an undercurrent of fear. The fallout from Flight 472 had been swift, and no one wanted to find themselves in her crosshairs. In her corner office overlooking the city skyline, Simone sat at her desk, her expression calm but focused. The previous night had been long. After the meeting in the private lounge, she had spent hours reviewing reports, drafting directives, and consulting with her legal team. Now, she was ready to put everything into motion. A soft knock at the door broke her concentration. It was Lewis, carrying a slim folder under his arm. He entered the office, closing the door behind him, and placed the folder on her desk. "This just came in," he said. "A full report on Brenner's employment history. You were right, there's a trail." Simone opened the folder, her eyes scanning the neatly typed pages. The report detailed a series of complaints filed against Matthew Brenner over the past 5 years. Passengers had accused him of everything from inappropriate comments to overtly discriminatory behavior. Several junior stewards had also submitted complaints, describing him as manipulative and prone to power trips. Yet each time, the complaints had been dismissed or quietly buried by his supervisors. Every warning ignored, Simone murmured, her voice quiet but heavy with disapproval. She closed the folder and looked up at Lewis. "This isn't just about him anymore. It's about everyone who enabled him." Lewis nodded. "What's the plan?" Simone leaned back in her chair, her gaze distant as she considered her next move. "I want his supervisors on suspension by the end of the day. HR will conduct interviews with every crew member who's ever worked under him, and I want an independent review of our complaint handling processes. No more sweeping things under the rug." Lewis raised an eyebrow. "That's going to shake things up." "Good," Simone said firmly. "It's long overdue." By midday, the airline's intranet lit up with a company-wide memo from Simone. In it, she outlined the events of Flight 472 not in sensationalist terms, but with cold, hard facts. She acknowledged the failure of internal processes, committed to sweeping reforms, and emphasized the importance of integrity at every level of the organization. The memo concluded with a clear statement. "As the CEO of this airline, I take full responsibility for ensuring that incidents like this never happen again." This is not just a promise, it's a mandate. To our passengers, our employees, and our stakeholders, the days of silence and complacency are over. The reaction was immediate. Employees across the company, many of whom had grown disillusioned with the culture, felt a renewed sense of purpose. Social media buzzed with praise from passengers who admired the airline's transparency and commitment to change. But there were also detractors, particularly within the industry, who questioned the wisdom of exposing such vulnerabilities publicly. Simone didn't care. She wasn't in this for appearances. She was in it for results. 2 days later, Simone found herself back at the airport, preparing to board another flight. This time, she was traveling for a long-planned corporate retreat with senior executives. Unlike her undercover journey on Flight 472, this trip was no secret. Word had already spread that Simone Carter herself would be flying coach for the first leg of her journey, a deliberate choice to demonstrate her belief in equality and fairness at every level of the passenger experience. As she approached the gate, she noticed the hushed whispers and furtive glances from staff and passengers alike. She met their curiosity with a calm smile, her confidence unshaken. Lewis walked a few steps behind her, his ever-watchful presence as discreet as always. When she boarded the plane, the crew greeted her with a mix of respect and nervousness. The lead steward, a young woman named Elena, seemed especially anxious. Simone paused as she stepped into the cabin, her eyes scanning the familiar setting. "You must be Elena," she said warmly. The steward blinked, clearly startled. "Yes, ma'am. Welcome aboard." Simone's smile widened slightly. "Relax. You're doing fine." Elena nodded, her posture straightening as she stepped aside to let Simone pass. Simone took her seat, buckled her seatbelt, and opened the book she had brought for the flight. She had barely started reading when Elena approached her again, holding a tray with a glass of sparkling water. "This is for you, ma'am," Ella said, her voice steady but tinged with reverence. Simone looked up and accepted the glass with a small nod. Thank you, Elena. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Simone reflected on the changes already set in motion. Matthew Brenner had been officially terminated, his supervisors placed on indefinite suspension pending investigation. The HR department had issued a formal apology to the employees whose complaints had been ignored, and an independent consultancy had been hired to oversee the implementation of new accountability measures. But Simone knew this was only the beginning. True change wasn't about issuing statements or firing a few people. It was about creating a culture where respect and integrity were woven into the fabric of the organization. It was about building something that would outlast her tenure, something that would stand as a legacy. As the flight leveled out at cruising altitude, Simone leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes. For the first time in days, she allowed herself a moment of quiet. She wasn't one to dwell on the past, but she couldn't help but think back to Flight 472, the confrontation, the humiliation, the resolve it had sparked within her. Matthew Brenner had underestimated her, as had so many before him. But in doing so, he had given her an opportunity to shine a light on the cracks in the system and to fix them. A voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Elena, standing beside her seat with an apologetic expression. "Yves, Carter, I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said softly. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything you're doing. It means a lot to all of us." Simone opened her eyes and smiled. "You're not disturbing me, Elena. And thank you for your hard work. It doesn't go unnoticed." The steward nodded, her face brightening, and returned to her duties. Simone watched her go, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. This was why she did what she did, not for the praise, but for the impact. For the chance to make things better, one step at a time. When the plane landed and Simone disembarked, she walked through the terminal with her head held high. The whispers and glances followed her, but this time she welcomed them. She had made her presence known, not as a CEO demanding respect, but as a leader committed to earning it. As she exited the airport, she glanced at Louis, who walked beside her with his usual composed demeanor. "Ready for the next flight?" she asked. Louis smiled faintly. "Always." Simone stepped outside, the sunlight warming her face as she looked toward the horizon. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long while, she felt that the path ahead was clear, and she was more than ready to take the next step.